Hello.
Hello.
That's right. It is YouTube time this time all the time.
If you like poetry, if you like literature, if you like cultural history, then you've come to the right place. We make podcasts about all of those things. So be sure to like and share this video. And of course, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload.
Since we mostly make podcasts, you can also find our shows on all the major podcast platforms. So if you found this video, but YouTube isn't your speed for regular podcast listening, head over to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe there.
All right. Hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello and welcome to this all-new episode of Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast. I am your co-host, Jack Rossiter-Munley.
And I am your other co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And we are coming to you with another episode featuring a fantastic poem. It's actually a poem that comes at the beginning of a novel, but we'll get to that in a minute. Very quickly before we do, our regular reminder that if you are so inclined, we really appreciate it when you hop on over to the iTunes store or Apple Podcasts, however you like to refer to it, and leave us a rating and review. Ratings and reviews are by far the best way to warm our hearts in this trying time, and also to help us move up the algorithms of the internet and find more listeners.
Yes, the algorithms are inherently biased against poetry, and it's only through our concerted efforts and your concerted efforts that we can make strong steps forwards against the algorithms of the
During
internet.
this Poetry Month, we're starting a Twitter campaign, hashtag defeat the algorithm.
Yes, I'm sure that will be happening.
Hashtag defeat the algorithm for poetry 2020.
Oh, man.
I'm excited about this social media revolution we're about to lead. But before we get to that, we should probably do the poetry analysis that we do, every other week. And this week we have the poem that opens the book Ceremony, which is a poem usually titled as Ceremony, by Leslie Marmon Silko. Well, I guess one thing I wanted to say is that part of why I picked this poem is because I think, given how difficult the present time is dealing with a global pandemic and the ramifications of it, I think a lot of us are turning to stories and storytelling and creating our own little ceremonies within our lives to find strength and to find solace, whether it's creating narratives out of our daily experience and journaling, or just, telling stories for yourself, being creative and telling stories. If you're, in, lockdown with another person, you might entertain each other with stories, or you might return to the stories that bring you comfort, whether it's books or movies or plays or podcasts or whatever. That sort of elemental human drive towards story and narrative comes to the forefront, I think, in difficult times, and we find stories not just to tell ourselves and each other, but that give us strength and sustenance. And so I thought a poem about, the power of story and kind of the positive power of story and ceremony was particularly appropriate.
I like that a lot. Yeah.
Leslie Marmon Silko is from the Laguna Pueblo tribe. She herself is of mixed heritage, but talks about how she was raised in the Laguna culture and that she identifies herself with that culture, even though she also spends most of her written work interrogating what having a mixed heritage has meant to her. And in fact, the book Ceremony is one of the books where she examines that, because the main character is himself of mixed heritage. She basically has been a very successful writer from the time she started out. Her very first story got a lot of critical acclaim and attention, and her first book was Ceremony, which got all sorts of different attention and awards. She herself won the MacArthur in 1981, and she was the Native Writers Circle of the America's Lifetime Achievement Award winner in 1994. Some of her other major books, the follow-up to Ceremony, was a not quite it's like a multi-genre book called Storyteller that mixed poetry and prose, and if I'm remembering correctly, some photographs as well. It's very cool. And then this sort of magisterial, mega-length novel called The Almanac of the Dead, which I highly, highly recommend. But yeah, we're here to talk about Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony.
Boom. I can't wait. She's so good.
So this is an excerpt from Ceremony, the poem Ceremony, which opens the book Ceremony, by Leslie Marmon Silko. Ts'its'tsi'nako, thought woman, is sitting in her room, and whatever she thinks about appears. She thought of her sisters, Nau'ts'ity'i and I'tcts'ity'i, and together they created the universe, this world and the 4 worlds below. Thought woman, the spider, named things, and as she named them, they appeared. She's sitting in her room, thinking of a story now. I'm telling you the story she is thinking. Ceremony. I will tell you something about stories, he said. They aren't just for entertainment. Don't be fooled. They're all we have, you see. All we have to fight off illness and death. You don't have anything if you don't have the stories. Their evil is mighty, but it can't stand up to our stories. So they try to destroy the stories. Let the stories be confused or forgotten. They would like that. They would be happy, because we would be defenseless then. He's rubbing his belly. I keep it in here, he said. Here, put your hand on it. See? It is moving. There's life here for the people. And in the belly of this story, the rituals and the ceremony are still growing. What she said, the only cure I know is a good ceremony. That's what she said. Sunrise.
Okay.
So that's the poem. And the thing that happens, just for some context, the thing that happens right after this is at the beginning of the book is that you find the main character, and I think a little bit of the implication is the sun rises and that story begins of the book, the sun rises on him.
That makes a lot of sense. And also there's a lot of context in cultural or historical that we could get into, but the basic one that I found really helpful is that the poem, in part at least, is a retelling of a traditional Laguna creation myth. So the thought woman is as a part of the oral tradition of the Laguna people. She is in the stories, she is the one who's creates the universe basically, and so in part the poem is a retelling of that story. Definitely,
yeah. Ts'its'tsi'nako is thought woman or spider woman in this story, and yeah, she's this creator figure. And then Nau'ts'ity'i is corn woman, and I'tcts'ity'i is reed woman. And this element is sort of threaded through the story of the novel Ceremony as well. There are elements of this that show up throughout it. Yeah, I really like this because it's independent of being the opening to the book. It is this interesting partial retelling of legend, but also this kind of meditation on stories and storytelling and their power and importance, which seemed particularly relevant lately.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Yeah, no, it's really, it's fascinating because it's one of those things where it's kind of like a story and a story and a story and a story. So it's it's the opening to a novel, so it's already like a framing for that and like a part of that in a kind of way. It's retelling the sort of, creation myth of the Laguna Pueblo. But then there's also like, then the poem is so, it's kind of funny, I think. Like, there's this part in the middle. She is sitting in her room, the thought woman, and thinking of a story now. I'm telling you the story she is thinking. Um, Ceremony. And then it's like, I will tell you something about stories, he said. They aren't just for entertainment. So there we have like, not only is Thought Woman part of the traditional, the creation myth, but in the poem, Thought Woman is thinking of the story, and then the speaker is relaying the story that Thought Woman is thinking of. And then, would you say that the he said, is he the kind of main character that's to come, or is that because it's kind of a little unknown in the poem who the he is? It acquires a very almost like fiction prose style with like you're in scene of someone who's saying something and it's like he said, and then it's a little bit of a mind bender.
To your point about is the he the main character from the novel, my own reading is that he is, but he is the main character from the end of the novel, not at the beginning. It is after the journey he goes through where he experiences all of these different stories and healing ceremonies and all this sort of stuff. It's him with the knowledge he's gained over the course of the novel, but it's plopped down at the beginning, which is like another analytical loop added in to this. As you were saying, like it's story on story on story stacking, which I think sets up just how important and integral storytelling and stories and ceremonies are. But it also, I think you're right, even if it's not intentionally funny, it does also set up like a playful relationship to stories. They're incredibly important. They're very serious. They have, super weight and power, and they're these essential things. But also because they are so essential and they are so integrated, there's a level of familiarity with them. Almost like a really good friendship where you can be very serious, but you can also be silly, and you can flip between those two pretty easily. And like one doesn't negate the other, it actually strengthens it.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because it's interesting because like also like on the one hand, I like said all those different story in a story, and I was like, Jesus, poem is like seems like it's a I don't know like a post like modern opaque kind of blah blah blah. But then the beauty of the poem is like the language is very, pared down and pretty simple. And so the layers are acquired like almost without you realizing, and it's like pretty easy to follow. But then, you know, like the effect of the layering, I think, is still like something that's, really doing a lot of work. Um, yeah, and it's interesting because I was sort of thinking about like, and this is something that you said, it's like, what would be the difference of just sort of like, say, telling the creation myth sort of straight up versus like telling it in this roundabout, many framed way. And one thing, which is kind of what you had brought up, is like it highlights the importance of storytelling sort of itself, where you like because there's so much, so many layers of storytelling. There's the content of the story, and then there's the telling of the story. And by kind of layering it so much, your attention is drawn toward the telling itself, which often, like, not every poem announces that it's a poem. And like a lot of the joy of poetry or literature is to be sort of, transported into some other place, potentially. And in those moments, you're in the content of the story rather than you're thinking about the telling itself. Um, but then I was also thinking of, this is like maybe a very weird uh, connection to make, but I was trying to think of like other like many framed narratives that I've like encountered. Um, and the one that stuck out to me was Plato's Symposium, which is a real deep cut.
One of the deepest cuts in Western literature, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
I know. I don't. It's yeah. But anyway, but basically in the Symposium, there's like a million things that are very different about this poem. But basically, there's like they're trying to like describe, what the nature of love is. But the way that it's told is like, rather than, a piece of philosophy that's like, I am announcing a definition and I will explain it and then I will prove it. It's basically like, this party, and then new people come like to the party, and then they like they ran into someone on the way to the party who like was in this kind of situation, and then they told that person about what they thought love was or something, and then they sort of relay it to the group. Um anyway, so what you get is this kind of like basically, kind of like a play or sort of a dramatic, like multiple voices, um, which, like, anyway, it's doing different things, but one thing that the Symposium I felt like was interesting about was like the and this is maybe not what Plato was trying to do. I cannot speculate as to his intentions. Um, like the truth or the most right definition of love is not attainable or even the most important thing, basically, because of the way that everything is so framed. And so, like, no character emerges like as the ultimate authority on love. You probably get a sense of like what Plato likes the best based on like some of them are sort of dopes and things like that. Rather than sort of emerging with like one, like truth that, one piece of dogma, you have this like whole range of like ideas about what love can be. And it's not quite happening that way in this poem. But I do feel like the other connection, um, is it was making me think of when we talked about D.G. Nanookpik's poem Warming, and she had talked about in her like she did kind of like a sort of description of her own work and process in this anthology, New Poets of Native Nations. And in it, she kind of was saying, like, the poems that I write are like not my voice, like only. Like, I'm telling the story like alongside the stories of my ancestors and future people, like at the same time. And I am just sort of giving voice to something that's already there. Um, and so, in the same sense that, like, in the Symposium, the authority of the voice is kind of like fragmented or dispersed. And in the poem Ceremony, Silko as the speaker, we can sometimes think about, like, the speaker as, and we often turn to poems of like for wisdom or for like sort of observations that are like really powerful, and oftentimes like one voice kind of like speaking not like pedantically, but like, with great force is uh, like a really powerful effect. Um, but here, because of all the layering of the stories and all this different storytelling, like Silko as the poet and also the speaker as the speaker of the poem is kind of like spreading out like their authority as storytellers. And so you get the sense of like there's not, even though this is like the creation myth of how the universe got started, like there's no clear beginning about like when the story first got told. And in that sense, there's less, exclusive ownership over it, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that totally makes sense, and I love it. And it puts me in mind of Walter Ong. I don't know if you're familiar with him,
Oh,
but
I love Walter.
right, of course, yeah. So Walter Ong, orality and literacy, and it's very much, I think, sort of what you're getting at, talking about, this both diffusion of authorial authority, but at the same time, that's just kind of existing in a world where stories are. They aren't written down, they aren't codified, they exist. And that's sort of the dividing line that he draws between oral traditions and literate traditions, is that in oral traditions, stories just are, whereas in literate traditions, they are given physical form, and then there is a notion of an official version of a story, and then there is the study of stories, basically. And those are the moves that happen in the shift between an oral tradition and a literate tradition. And I think what's really interesting is that in some ways, having an oral tradition where stories just exist kind of gives them a power all their own, separate from whoever is telling them. And I think the way that I at least understand the relationship that this poem then like creates to stories is that story is an entity that exists and can be accessed by people, but is not one that people can claim ownership of. It is something that they can sort of bring within them. It is something that can be accessed through ceremonies and other like actions, but it is its own thing. And in fact, I think if you go through the poem, you can see instances of that where, you talk about the power of stories. I'll tell you something about stories. He said they aren't just for entertainment. Don't be fooled. They're all we have to fight off illness and death. But you also get this notion of them being separate because even later on, where you get the sense that the he is maybe talking about stories that are within him. So it says, he rubbed his belly. I keep it in here, he said. Here, put your hand on it. See, it is moving. There is life here for the people. It doesn't actually say that that's a story. And in fact, right after that, it says, and in the belly of this story, the rituals and the ceremony are still growing. So the he there is created as this entity that has life for the people within him. But the very next stanza is about story as a separate, almost personified and embodied entity that contains its own gifts within its belly. So I think there's almost a parody there between a suggested physical person's body and this entity of story that exists, which I find really captivating as something that the poem does. And again, gets back to kind of what you were saying. So like, in the Symposium, you get an idea of what Plato thinks about love, but it's almost this preservation of an oral tradition of all these different voices telling you what they think. And that hints at this, perhaps out there somewhere is a Platonic ideal of love that cannot be effectively accessed by individuals, but which is an entity whose existence is suggested by all of these people trying and failing to articulate it. And I feel like this goes in that direction in terms of its relationship to stories.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I love that a lot. And yeah, that's such a good distinction to pull out with "and in the belly of this story" being similar, but like, yeah, just another distinction and different from the he. And it makes me think of this other part in the poem, like that's after the "Don't be fooled, they're all we have." You see, the he says, "You don't have anything if you don't have the stories," um, and it makes me think about like there's like the story, the content of the story, what's happening in the story. Then there's like the telling of the story, the sort of action of telling it. But then there's like having a story, which is kind of like, he says, you don't have anything if you don't have the stories. And obviously, I think there's like close connections between all three of those things, and the telling of stories, to like new generations of people, allow them to kind of in effect have those stories. But I think like, and their ability to access them, as you were kind of saying. But I sort of think that is like especially important in terms of what comes after. Then their evil is mighty, but it can't stand up to our stories. So they try to destroy the stories, let the stories be confused or forgotten. They would like that. They would be happy because we would be defenseless then. And we have this kind of huge they, which like probably can be read many ways, but one sort of seemingly clear reading of it to me is like white settler, like American people who have kind of both in the long historical sense, like committed genocide against indigenous people to, in the Americas, and then otherwise like displaced them and enslaved them. But then also in the kind of like specific sense of what might be, Silko's like own experience, or like so there was, I was just reading, so she grew up initially on the Laguna reservation, but then she was sent to like this like kind of boarding school, like Christian boarding school, which was a very common and thing, like to send indigenous kids to these boarding schools where oftentimes they weren't allowed to speak their they could only speak English, or things like that. And one, like the effects of that are devastating in many number of ways, but one effect of it is it like takes one's like stories away from you. Like if you can't speak your native language, you can't like really tell those stories as easily that are like essential to your culture or whatever. And so I kind of was thinking like the storytelling is important, but then also like having the stories to tell and like making sure that they have them is like very important in their kind of resistance against like white people and white supremacy. Which I haven't read Ceremony, but I got the sense I know that a lot of her writing has to do with like alienation from white society, is kind of like I think that's a quote from maybe the Poetry Foundation, but at any rate, yeah, that was another kind of dimension that I was really interested by.
Definitely. And in terms of the language, as you brought up, if you don't have your language, you can't receive stories from elders who don't speak English, if that's the tradition that you're raised in, like that can be a whole like generational barrier for people. Many immigrant communities, in addition to native communities, struggle with that all the time. If young people don't learn their native languages, which is very easy not to do in the United States, then, you know, maybe your grandparents have a whole well of stories that you're just never going to access, or like have an extra barrier to access. To your last point, I think that's really interesting. Obviously, yeah, I think there's deep personal resonances for Silko and her own background. In the context of the book, the main character is a returning World War II veteran who is suffering from what is usually referred to in ceremony as battle fatigue, basically PTSD. And so definitely alienation. He's also of mixed ancestry, which leads to all sorts of different complications, as you can imagine. But in terms of who the they is, whose evil is mighty, that is perhaps separating him from the stories and the ceremonies that could be healing to him, which is sort of the general arc of the novel, absolutely, it's, you know, he went to go fight in this war, and World War II has all sorts of different, you know, history that is laid onto it fairly or unfairly. It is usually thought of as the good war, where the United States heroically liberated the world, you know, stepped in, did its part for the cause of freedom and justice, which is part of the story, but also for many people from the United States who were from marginalized populations, it was this very weird experience of being asked to go fight fascism and oppression. These governments who were saying what in the United States you could say it was a version of saying the quiet part loud of what the United States was doing. You have these governments in Europe who are basically coming out and saying that they think groups of people are inferior in the United States, claiming that that's terrible. But at the same time, you know, you have German POWs who were taken to the South and treated better than many black people were. There's many accounts of that. My favorite anecdote about Hitler is that he had a fortified train that he rode around Europe in that has all kinds of crazy like modifications to be protected, and had a whole bathroom car that was all fancy and whatever. But he called his train America with a K until the United States entered the war, because he so admired what the United States had done to the native populations.
Oh man.
Right. So you can see why their evil, I think you are correct in that their evil is, in this case, it may specifically be referring to how the main character in Ceremony feels about his war experience, whether he's fully, you know, speaking it in that way at this point yet or not. But this is an element of how he feels about his war experience. And then the other thing about World War II is that it served as a major catalyst for the civil rights movements that then happened shortly after it ended, because it was because of the rhetoric around inclusion that the United States chose to deploy against the obviously much worse Nazi government in Germany. Like, the Nazis were the worst and terrible and awful in every imaginable way. But because the United States spoke about itself as their opposite, there was then a greater push, particularly in the African-American legal community at the time, with people like Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, who were saying, wait a minute, all that stuff you said was great, but now what if you followed through on it? And the United States was like, nah, I'm good. And then they were like, okay, but you're not. And then they changed history. So, yeah, I think that stanza about evil and they is really key, both because it kind of sets up the stakes, but again, it reasserts that stories are this like really essential balm against, you know, vicious external forces.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that's really great. I agree with all that. Yeah, and I, you know, just thinking about the poem some more, like, and stories, like, not to make it overly um, complicated, but it's just interesting to me, like the many different ways that stories are kind of approached in this poem. But then, like, we also have at the end, like, and in the belly of this story, the rituals and the ceremony are still growing. And there's this kind of, you were talking about it, and there's also this the fact that like a story is a living thing, and in that way too, like um it changes. And this is another thing, going back to like Walter Ong, and like from what I remember of the differences, which I'm sure have been problematized and made complicated, but like his distinctions between oral like traditions and like printing traditions and cultures, is that in like the in print culture and in writing traditions, there's this like static kind of, or in the same way that you try to get to the authoritative source, what that also means is you get something that doesn't change, so that you can refer to this thing and be like, no, this is what it is, and this is what it will always will be, rather than like an oral tradition, which, as he would say, like in its retelling, like it's changing, and so there's no like there's less fixedness of the stories themselves, and they have a more like organic quality, and that's sort of like made possible by the tellings of them over and over again. Yeah, I just was it's there's like kind of rare the poem is like different than a lot of poems that I encounter in, certain ways, because it lacks like a lot of concrete grounding, if that makes sense. Starting the with Thought Woman in her room, um, and then we have the kind of creation story, but then we like move, she's sitting in her room, we don't really know what the room looks like, and then the I comes in, is like, I'll tell you what she's thinking about, and then the he comes sort of out of nowhere, and like at the same time the language is like a lot of spoken. You can imagine someone saying it rather than like, so, I guess like something written down, which is just to say, like it sort of relies less on these kind of like concrete details, like, okay, here you are, I'm sort of bringing you into this room, or I'm describing this object, which will then become the metaphor, blah, blah, blah. So, with all this concrete detail and like all this kinds of stuff, this poem is not interested in doing that. But then when those moments like do kind of happen, they're interesting. And like the belly is like one of the most sort of like visible and concrete moments of the poem, I felt, where it's like he rubbed his belly, and then you jump to the belly of this story, and then you're making that figurative leap there. And then also the very end of the poem, Sunrise, is like another, like it's not, again, it's just one word, and it's, as you were saying, kind of like framing the opening of the novel. But it's also ending this poem, which has been like less about images and sort of concrete details and scenes. It ends on an image, and it ends on like not a statement, just sunrise. And I guess I wasn't quite sure what to make of that, but I felt like it was a very interesting movement in the poem, and like to end there like felt important somehow.
I totally agree. It's the only really, because even the belly in the room, there's a lot of versions of what that looks like, you know? There's a lot of bellies out there. There's a lot of rooms. Like,
You heard it here first. There's a lot of bellies out there, folks.
Breaking closed talking news. A lot of bellies out there. A lot of rooms. But like, and then even after you hear about his belly, then you hear about the belly of a story. So it's like now this nebulous idea of belly as like warm embodied container that can also be applied to story. And at least for me, when I hear room at the beginning of the poem, I'm immediately in like still in some sort of dream space room that doesn't really have walls and is just kind of wherever Thought Woman hangs out. And it's not a place. It's not a placey place, you know. It's not like
yeah.
It's a whole thing, but we all have a pretty standard image of a sunrise. I mean, no two sunrises are alike, blah, 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 whatever. There's a sun in our world, you know, like the sun to belly ratio is pretty extreme. That's all I'm saying.
True. A lot more bellies than suns.
Many more bellies than suns. Again, heard it here first. Man, we're covering a lot of new ground.
As 538 would say, #analysis.
Even though all sunrises are technically different, it's still a much more unified image for most readers where you have an idea of what a sunrise is in a way that I think you don't have that handle on anything else. And also it ends on this very I won't say very concrete. It's the most concrete moment in the poem, though still very general. But it also ends on this very hopeful image.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I also think, obviously, the title of the novel and the poem is Ceremony, so that's obviously very important. But I think, like, the poem also ends, you know, the only cure is ceremony. And to me, I don't have much to say about it, but to me, I was thinking about stories and storytelling and the way that, like, the ceremony in one sense is like the physical embodiment of the storytelling potentially, you know, where you like I was kind of in the beginning, I was saying story so many times that it felt very abstract for a moment. But the idea of a ceremony is a very embodied event. And I think like that plus the sunrise sort of grounds us at the end in the physical in a way that, I think, you know, as you were saying, is very hopeful. But also, just like, I don't know, just very cool. I don't have a better word for it. But I like it a lot.
Definitely. And to your point about the sheer number of times the word story is repeated and the number of times it's referenced in slightly different ways, I thought it was interesting because on the one hand, it does lead to this sort of, you know, is it this postmodern deconstruction of the idea of story? Is it this, like, you know, dispersal of what that means? Or, on the other hand, is it just like the most basic language you can use to talk about this thing? Sure, it kind of shifts around on you, but it's just like every time we're talking about stories, I'm just going to say story. And it's almost like you're just throwing another stone in the bucket to make it more, to have more unified heft. And I think it's cool that it can go in both directions.
Yeah.
And both kind of end up in the same space, because I think by having a diffusion of what story could be, that lends it a certain kind of power, and by honing in on one idea of story and giving that more weight, that is also a different kind of power. But I think in both directions, the idea of story becomes empowered.
I agree with that completely. I like that a lot. Should we read it again?
Let's read it again. So this is Excerpt from Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. Ts'its'inako, Thought Woman, is sitting in her room, and whatever she thinks about appears. She thought of her sisters, Nau'ts'ity'i and I'tcts'ity'i, and together they created the universe. this world, and the 4 worlds below. Thought woman, the spider, named things, and as she named them, they appeared. She's sitting in her room, thinking of a story now. I'm telling you the story she is thinking. Ceremony. I will tell you something about stories, he said. They aren't just for entertainment. Don't be fooled. They're all we have, you see. All we have to fight off illness and death. You don't have anything if you don't have the stories. Their evil is mighty, but it can't stand up to our stories. So they try to destroy the stories, let the stories be confused or forgotten. They would like that. They would be happy because we would be defenseless then. He rubbed his belly. I keep it in here, he said. Here, put your hand on it. See? It is moving. There is life here.
Hey, thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Those reviews help us with the algorithm and are the best way for us to find new listeners.
Do you have thoughts about this poem? Or is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? We would love to hear from you, and there are tons of ways to get in touch.
Yes, you can send us an email to closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. I'm at Jack Rossiter Munn, Connor is at Connor M. Stratton, and the show is at Close Talking.
On Instagram, we are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/closetalking.
And speaking of all of those many and varied social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena. Woo woo! Woo.
Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Come back again.
Please come back just one more time.
Door's always open. Okay, bye.
See ya.